Scroll disclaimer: this is a work of fiction inspired by the real-life Highclere Castle, famously known as the filming location of Downton Abbey. While the setting is real, all characters, events, and supernatural elements in the story are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This story blends mystery, suspense, and horror, and is not intended to reflect the true history or ownership of Highclere Castle. It all started with a letter, an envelope as elegant as it was mysterious. Tucked in her mail among bills and catalogs, the thick parchment envelope stood out like a relic from another century. Amelia Carter, a New York-based journalist known for her work in uncovering forgotten historical legends, opened it with the cautious curiosity of someone used to dealing with hoaxes. But this was different. The letter was handwritten in a beautiful cursive script, inviting her to spend a long weekend at Highclere Castle, the real-life setting of the famed Downton Abbey. What caught her attention wasn't the prestige or the luxurious offer, but a strange line in the middle of the letter: "This estate has stories that history refused to tell. We believe you are the one to uncover them." At first, she suspected a publicity stunt. Maybe a themed press event or a fan convention disguised as a historical investigation. But the more she dug into the invitation, the more legitimate it seemed. The email address matched the official contact listed on the estate's website. The phone number connected her to a polite but elusive British gentleman who simply introduced himself as Mr. Claiborne, the head of the household's internal affairs. He wouldn't elaborate on what she'd find, only that she was being offered unfiltered access to all wings of the property. "No velvet ropes, no red tape," he said with a hint of amusement. "But what you uncover is yours to tell, if you can understand it." Amelia, seasoned as she was, couldn't resist. She'd covered stories from cursed Appalachian towns to unmarked plague pits beneath old churches in Prague. But the idea of something truly hidden inside one of Britain's most iconic mansions pulled her in. She booked her flight, packed her notebooks and voice recorder, and told her editor she'd be off-grid for a few days, just in case the place turned out to be as remote and strange as it sounded. Her taxi ride from Heathrow Airport was a winding journey through the English countryside, with the driver making occasional remarks about the castle's odd hours and high turnover of staff. "They say it's haunted, you know," he said with a chuckle. "But then again, what old castle isn't?" Amelia smiled politely but made a mental note of it. Even rumors had roots somewhere. When the towering silhouette of Highclere Castle finally came into view, a chill ran down her spine, not from fear, but from awe. It rose like a relic of Gothic ambition, with its intricate spires piercing the sky and ivy crawling like veins along the aged stone. The sunset bathed it in a golden light, but even then, something about it seemed off. She couldn't shake the feeling that the castle was watching her back. She was greeted at the entrance by a line of staff, all dressed formally, too formally for what she assumed would be a casual visit. Mr. Claiborne stood at the front, tall and gaunt with sharp eyes that seemed to scan her more than welcome her. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and calm. "You've arrived precisely when expected." No one took her bags. Instead, they were already placed in her room before she even set foot inside. The staff quickly dispersed, and she was left alone with Mr. Claiborne. "The household runs on old rhythms," he said cryptically. "We don't do modern check-ins or guided tours here. You'll find the estate open to you, but do be mindful of locked doors. They're locked for a reason." As she walked through the grand hall, passing tapestries, oil paintings, and candlelit corridors, Amelia could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. But beneath the layers of aristocratic charm, there was something else, something lurking. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't going to be a weekend retreat. It was an invitation to a haunting. Amelia's first full day at Highclere Castle began with a strange sense of disorientation. The morning sun filtered through the tall, leaded windows of her guest room, casting lattice-shaped shadows on the ornate carpet. Her bed was neatly made, despite her distinctly remembering leaving the sheets crumpled from a restless night. Even odder, her recorder and notepad were placed neatly on the writing desk by the window. She was almost certain she had left them in her bag. She dismissed it as staff being thorough and got dressed for her self-guided exploration. The castle was breathtaking. Each corridor opened into rooms filled with centuries of wealth and history. From grand chandeliers to elaborately painted ceilings, Amelia found herself moving through a living museum. There were oil portraits of solemn-looking lords and ladies gazing down with cold detachment, bookshelves that reached to the ceiling, and furniture so old and well-preserved that even sitting on it felt like a violation. But beauty didn't always bring comfort. There was something unsettling beneath the charm. The castle felt off. The silence between rooms was heavy, not peaceful. She would walk into the library and swear she heard pages turning, only to find no one there. When she paused to admire a grand piano in the drawing room, she thought she heard a key being pressed, just once, softly and deliberately. She turned around quickly, but the room was empty. At lunch, she found herself alone in the formal dining room, where an elaborate three-course meal had been prepared on fine china, yet there was no cook in sight. Mr. Claiborne eventually appeared and sat across from her with a glass of red wine he never sipped. She asked him about the castle's history, but his answers were vague and rehearsed. The house has stood since the 17th century. It's seen war, birth, betrayal, like all great homes, he said flatly. When she asked about the restricted wing she'd seen from the outside, a long portion of the castle with shuttered windows and a rusted lock on the door, his demeanor changed. There are parts of this estate that have been closed for the safety of our guests, he said. Some memories should remain undisturbed. He changed the subject immediately, asking if she found the library inspirational for her writing. That evening, Amelia continued her investigation. She wandered through servant corridors that smelled faintly of damp stone, staircases that creaked under her weight even though they looked solid, and empty guest rooms staged as if waiting for someone to return after centuries. One room had dozens of dolls arranged in a perfect circle, with no explanation for their placement or why the door was slightly ajar. She didn't stay long. In the main gallery, she noticed a strange pattern. Every portrait of the castle's past residents showed them with something hidden in the background, a shadow, a partially drawn curtain, a mirror reflecting a figure that didn't quite match. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but the more she looked, the more she noticed. The artwork seemed to whisper stories, but only if you stared long enough. Later that night, unable to sleep, she ventured into one of the unused drawing rooms. The fire had been recently lit, although no one had been there. She took a seat and stared into the flames, trying to understand what this place was hiding. The shadows danced across the room, and for a brief second, she thought she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching her. She stood up quickly and turned the corner, nothing. Just a long, empty passageway and the sound of the wind brushing against stained glass. She returned to her room and found a new envelope on her pillow identical to the first, with no sign of who left it. Inside was a single line written in the same ornate handwriting, "Not everything that sleeps is dead." The message chilled her to the bone. It was clear now, this castle wanted to be discovered, but only on its terms. And whatever it was hiding, it was beginning to notice her. The following morning, Amelia woke with a sense of urgency gnawing at her. The line from the mysterious note, "Not everything that sleeps is dead," replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. It wasn't just a warning, it felt like an invitation. Something inside Highclere Castle wanted her to look deeper, and she was beginning to understand exactly where she needed to go, the locked wing. She'd seen it from the outside the day before, a long, vine-covered stretch of the castle, where the windows were dark and sealed, unlike the rest of the bright, lively estate. There was something ancient about that part of the building, as though time itself had been reluctant to touch it. Mr. Claiborne had told her it was sealed for safety, but that only piqued her curiosity further. Later that afternoon, Amelia ventured out with her camera and notebook, tracing the walls of the castle from inside. It didn't take long before she found the heavy double doors that led to the restricted wing. They were constructed from thick oak, reinforced with iron bands. A large padlock hung from the handles, and 2 chains were wrapped around it like a barrier against something desperate to escape. But more than the physical barrier, It was the air around the doors that stopped her. It felt colder. The hallway was quiet, too quiet, like sound itself didn't want to linger. She touched the lock. It was freezing cold, even though the rest of the castle was comfortably warm. Just then, the hallway lights flickered, not just dimmed, but pulsed, like the castle was breathing. She stepped back, heart racing, and nearly dropped her camera when a low creaking sound came from behind the door, as if something had shifted in the darkness beyond. Amelia quickly left the hallway and returned to the main part of the house, hoping to calm herself with a walk through the gardens. But Mr. Claiborne intercepted her before she could reach the door. "You shouldn't have gone near that wing," he said sharply, eyes narrowing. "I was just looking around," she replied, keeping her tone casual. He paused, then leaned in slightly. "Curiosity, Miss Carter, has a cost in this house. Do not mistake silence for absence. Some things are better left alone." His tone was no longer polite, it was threatening. That night, unable to sleep, Amelia pored over the floor plans she had photographed from an estate archive room earlier in the day. She realized something strange. The restricted wing had no bathrooms or servant passages. That was highly unusual for a house of its size and period. What's more, it had once been listed as a chapel in older blueprints, but the label had been scratched out in recent records. Why would a chapel be sealed off? Fueled by adrenaline and a hunch, she decided to return, this time under cover of night. She crept through the halls with only a small flashlight and her recorder. The castle was even more surreal at night. The silence seemed alive, and the air pressed against her skin like a thick fog. As she approached the locked doors again, she was shocked to find the chains gone. The padlock lay on the ground, open, as if someone or something had undone it for her. Her hand trembled as she pushed open one of the heavy doors. It groaned loudly, echoing down the corridor. The smell hit her first: old stone, damp earth, and something sickly sweet, like decayed flowers. She stepped inside. The hallway beyond was dim, lit only by faded skylight slats and long-dead sconces. Dust floated in the air, thick enough to see. The walls here were different, covered in old, faded religious symbols and murals, but many had been scratched out violently. Amelia's footsteps were the only sound, muffled by the thick carpet of dust. It felt like no one had been here in over a century. She turned a corner and found herself in what looked like a former chapel. The pews were broken and overturned, and a massive black tapestry covered what she guessed was the altar. The temperature dropped suddenly, and her breath formed clouds in the air. As she moved closer, her flashlight flickered. She shook it, but it died completely. In the dark, she heard a sound, soft, rhythmic, like whispering in Latin. Her heart pounded as she turned to leave, but the entrance had vanished. Where the door had been, there was now only stone wall. Panic set in. She stumbled backward, bumping into one of the overturned pews. That's when she saw the eyes, two faint glowing shapes in the door. The events in the restricted wing had shaken her to the core, but the part that unsettled her most wasn't what she saw, it was what disappeared. The hallway, the door, the chapel, all gone as if they'd never existed. And yet, the scratch on her forearm remained. Proof. Or maybe a warning. The next morning, her room felt colder than before. Her breath lightly misted in the air, even though the fireplace had been lit. She glanced at the mirror and froze. There were faint letters traced in the condensation on the glass. Look beneath. The message vanished seconds later, as if it had never been there. Driven by equal parts fear and obsession, Amelia tore through the room, tapping along the wooden walls, pressing on the floorboards, and checking under the furniture. She almost gave up until she noticed something odd about a section of the wainscoting beneath the window. There was a faint draft coming through. She knelt down and felt along the wall until her fingers caught the edge of a loose panel. With some force, she pried it open. Inside was a narrow space no wider than a shoebox. Dust and cobwebs coated everything, but in the center sat a small, leather-bound journal. It was cracked with age, the leather brittle, the pages yellowed and crumbling. On the first page, written in precise, shaky handwriting, was a name: Eleanor Blythe, 1897. Amelia sat back on the bed, heart pounding, and began to read. The entries began like any young girl's journal. Eleanor had been a housemaid at Highclere Castle in the late 19th century. She wrote about her duties, her admiration for Lady Evelyn, the lady of the house at the time, and the kindness of the head cook. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. She began writing about strange occurrences, footsteps echoing through the halls at night when no one was there, paintings that seemed to change subtly from one day to the next, and whispers that called her name from behind locked doors. She mentioned the East Wing, the very one Amelia had entered, as a place the staff were forbidden to speak about. "We pretend it isn't there," Eleanor wrote. "But we all feel it watching." The entries grew darker. Eleanor described witnessing rituals in the basement, ceremonies performed by the lords and ladies of the house, not for God, but for something else. "They wear masks of bone and speak in tongues I do not know. Lady Evelyn leads them. She was kind before. Now she never blinks." One chilling passage read, "They say the house is alive. That it remembers. That it demands loyalty from its bloodline and silence from its servants. I've seen what happens to those who try to leave." Eleanor had tried to run away. She was caught. Her final entry was hurried and smudged, written with shaking hands. "They found my journal. I must hide it before they take me to the chapel. I hear the chanting already. They say it's for the good of the house. I don't want to die here." That was the last page. The rest of the journal was blank. Amelia sat in silence, the weight of the diary pressing on her chest. Eleanor had discovered the same darkness more than a century ago and tried to warn someone. She wondered how many others had done the same. How many voices had been silenced by the walls of Highclere? Determined to preserve the evidence, she photographed each page of the diary and recorded an audio narration for backup. She would not let Eleanor's words be forgotten. Later that day, as she tried to confront Mr. Claiborne with what she'd found, she was told he had taken ill and wouldn't be seen until morning. The staff avoided eye contact, speaking only when necessary. She was alone again. That evening, just as dusk settled, she returned to her room and found the diary missing. In its place was a new note, written in the same elaborate hand as before. Some stories were buried for a reason. "Don't dig too deep, Miss Carter." The castle was not just hiding its history, it was actively defending it. Amelia had never felt more watched in her life. Every movement she made inside Highclere Castle now carried the heavy sense of unseen eyes. The halls were no longer just old, they were alive, breathing with secrets that shifted behind locked doors and whispered through the drafty corridors. Ever since the diary disappeared, she hadn't seen Mr. Claiborne or any senior staff. Meals were left at her door, and no one spoke unless absolutely necessary. It was as if the castle had made its decision about her presence and was merely waiting. But Amelia wasn't one to back down. If anything, the disappearance of Eleanor's journal confirmed she was on the right path. There was a story here, real, dangerous, buried under aristocratic rituals and silenced for centuries. And she was determined to uncover it. That night, she stayed awake, dressed in black, camera charged and recorder tucked into her coat. She hadn't just relied on intuition anymore. Over the past day, she'd mapped out a pattern to the staff's nightly movements and noticed a particular route used frequently after midnight. A narrow staircase behind the west gallery seemed to lead down to the old wine cellars, off limits to guests. But something told her that was where the heart of the truth lay. She waited until 12:30 a.m. Then, silent as a shadow, she followed the hidden servants' corridor and descended the staircase. The deeper she went, the more the castle changed. The air grew dense and damp, the plastered walls giving way to bare stone, mossy and cracked with age. The electric lights ended halfway down, replaced by flickering oil sconces that felt far too deliberate. Someone was preparing this path, maintaining it for use. As she crept along a stone corridor, she began to hear it, the low hum of voices, rhythmic and ancient, not conversational but ceremonial. Chanting. She pressed herself against the cold wall and followed the sound until she reached a large wooden door slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw them. In a vaulted underground chamber lit by candles and iron holders, a group of figures stood in a circle. All were dressed in dark robes, faces covered by grotesque masks made of animal bone and gilded with gold leaf. In the center of the room was a stone platform, stained by age, possibly by something darker than just wine. Amelia's heart pounded as she raised her camera slowly, carefully filming the scene. At the head of the circle stood a woman elegant, regal, terrifying in her stillness. Her mask was different. It was polished silver with hollowed eyes and an open mouth, almost screaming in frozen agony. From her height and posture, Amelia guessed she was Lady Winthrop, the current owner of the estate. They began to chant louder now. Latin words, some recognizable, others twisted and foreign, rose into the damp air. Then the group lowered themselves to their knees. Two robed attendants brought something out from the shadows behind the altar. Amelia squinted and recoiled. It was a deer, bound and muzzled, its legs kicking slightly. It was still alive. Lady Winthrop raised a ceremonial dagger with a bone handle and something carved into the blade, symbols Amelia didn't recognize but instinctively feared. The chanting reached a crescendo, and just as the blade plunged downward, Amelia gasped. Too loud. The sound echoed in the corridor, louder than she intended. Inside the chamber, the figures turned as one. The chanting stopped. A dozen masked faces stared directly at the door. Amelia backed away, heart hammering. She turned to run but slipped on the whetstone, her camera clattering beside her. Within seconds, footsteps thundered behind her. Yet we let you wake. The aristocracy of Highclere weren't just nobility, they were keepers of something old, powerful, and dangerous. And now she had become part of the castle's secret. By now, Amelia wasn't certain what was real and what wasn't. The world outside her window looked the same, lush English countryside rolling. Servants she greeted moments earlier vanished down corridors that didn't seem to exist when she followed. Even more disturbing were the people she passed, guests, staff, even a few unfamiliar aristocrats. Their clothing was wrong. Not just outdated, but centuries out of date. One woman wore a Victorian morning dress, complete with jet beads and a lace veil. A man in a tailcoat bowed slightly as he passed Amelia, then disappeared through a door that hadn't been there an hour ago. When she rushed to follow, the door was gone. She began keeping notes again, sketching the shifting floor plan of the castle, marking where things moved, where doors appeared and disappeared, where time seemed to slow. Because it did slow. In one instance, Amelia entered the grand gallery at noon, watched the light stream in through the stained glass windows, and walked to the far end. When she turned back, the room was shrouded in dusk, and her watch showed 3 hours had passed. But she hadn't felt more than 5 minutes tick by. It wasn't just space that twisted in Highclere, it was time. Later that afternoon, as she tried to find her way back to the entrance hall, she came upon a corridor she hadn't seen before, long, narrow, lined with portraits in frames darker than the wood of the walls. The faces in the paintings stared down with blank, expressionless eyes. But when she turned to leave, one of the portraits had changed. The figure in the painting was no longer still, it had turned its head. Slightly, subtly, looking toward her. She blinked. It moved again. She ran. As she passed through the west wing, where the atmosphere was heaviest, she suddenly heard music, an old phonograph tune playing faintly, its melody warped by age. She followed it to a ballroom that should have been sealed off by construction tarps, but now appeared polished, clean, and alive. Golden chandeliers flickered overhead. The room glowed with warm candlelight. And people, dozens of them, twirled and laughed in 19th century attire, dancing as if in a dream. Amelia stepped through the threshold, her modern clothes clashing with the antique finery. No one noticed her. Or perhaps they couldn't see her. She watched, frozen, as a young woman in a burgundy gown turned toward her mid-dance. Her face, pale and beautiful, smiled, then changed. Was it trying to warn her? Drive her mad? Or show her something? That night, she dreamed of Eleanor again, the young maid from 1897. In the dream, Eleanor stood at the foot of her bed, face pale, eyes hollow. She spoke just 3 words, "You're still here." Amelia shot awake. Her watch was frozen at 3:33 a.m. The sun didn't rise the next morning. The longer Amelia stayed in Highclere Castle, the more reality unraveled around her. It wasn't just about seeing ghosts or witnessing strange events anymore. The castle itself was reshaping, pulling her into its depths. Something told her that whatever answers she sought, they were buried beneath the castle, beneath centuries of denial and silence. She took the servants' stairwell down, each step groaning like it remembered something terrible. The stone walls grew colder with each level she descended, and her flashlight flickered erratically as if protesting. When she reached the bottom, the cellar was different. This wasn't the same place she had explored before. This was older, untouched by restoration. The air smelled of mold, wet earth, and something else, something metallic. She found a door at the far end, an arched wooden relic reinforced with iron bands and a heavy lock. The key she had found earlier, hidden inside the hollow book in her room, fit perfectly. With a deep breath, she turned it and pushed the door open. What lay beyond wasn't a room, it was a tunnel. Carved directly into the bedrock, the passage stretched far beneath the castle. She walked for what felt like hours, walls narrowing around her. Strange carvings lined the stone, symbols she didn't recognize, but instinctively feared. They pulsed faintly when she passed, as if aware of her presence. Eventually, she reached a cavernous chamber, and what she saw stopped her heart. The room was circular, ancient, and at its center stood a stone altar covered in rust-colored stains. Around it were skeletal remains, some still clad in decayed Victorian clothing, others far older. Behind the altar was a mural, weathered but still vivid. It depicted a great darkness, something vast, shapeless, consuming people, buildings, entire landscapes. And beneath it, a symbol, the same sigil she had seen in the restricted wing and on the letter left on her pillow. The castle's secret wasn't a haunting, it was a containment. Centuries ago, Highclere had been built atop something evil. A void, a cursed entity, a being without form, but with insatiable hunger. The family that once ruled this land, ancestors of the current estate owners, had learned to appease it. Rituals, sacrifices, offerings of blood and memory. In return, the land remained fertile, their power unchallenged, their secrets hidden. And when the rituals failed, when the entity grew restless, it reached out. Through time, through space, through her. Amelia stumbled back, nauseated, dizzy with horror. That's why the castle twisted around her. Why she saw people from different eras. The place wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by itself. By its history. By all the pain and blood soaked into its stone. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. From the darkness behind her, she heard the slow scrape of something dragging across the stone. Not footsteps. Something heavier. Ancient. She turned, light trembling in her hand. But there was nothing there. Then the whispers began again. Louder. Closer. Stay. 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 The walls started to shift. The tunnel behind her narrowed, bricks moving like they were breathing. She ran, stumbling past the altar, past the bones, back into the corridor. Her flashlight died, but a dim glow began to rise from the floor itself, guiding her out, or luring her deeper, she couldn't tell. When she finally reached the cellar stairs, she slammed the wooden door shut and locked it behind her, panting, tears streaking her face. The next day, or what she assumed was day, since the sun still refused to rise, Amelia noticed the castle had changed again. The grand windows no longer showed the outside world. Instead, blackness pressed against the glass like a living thing, impenetrable and endless. Hallways twisted on themselves. Doors opened to brick walls. Mirrors reflected rooms that no longer existed. She tried to leave, of course. She grabbed her bag, raced to the main entrance, and threw open the massive front doors. Only to find another hallway waiting. The castle had swallowed her whole. In the silence that followed, she understood. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was a part of it. The nights grew longer, if they could even be called nights. The air grew heavier, charged with static. She started to hear Eleanor more clearly, not just in dreams, but in echoes, soft warnings slipping through the walls. "You have to choose," the voice whispered. "Fight it or finish it." Amelia began scouring the castle again, not to document, but to survive. She returned to the library, ransacked the records, decoded letters hidden in book margins. She pieced together the story of the original ritual, a ritual meant not to summon the darkness, but to bind it. Every 50 years, the bloodline of the estate had to offer a memory, a soul, something real, to keep the entity asleep. But someone had failed. And now the castle wanted her to continue the cycle. She found the binding circle etched into the ballroom. She could complete the ritual. Offer herself, her memories, her identity. Give up everything she was to seal the entity again and let Highclere rest. Or she could resist and let the castle collapse into the world beyond its walls. Become the seal. Or break it. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the horror of the truth. This was what happened to Eleanor. This was what had happened to all the others. Sacrifices forgotten by time. Lives erased to protect a world that would never know what was hidden beneath its history. She stepped into the circle. The candles flared. Her breath turned to mist. The air grew thick with pressure, and shadows writhed in the corners, and gave herself to the castle. They found her weeks later, wandering the grounds of Highclere, barefoot, dazed, with no memory of who she was or why she'd come. Her notes were gone. Her equipment vanished. Her passport, her ID, burned into ash in the fireplace of her room. The estate manager claimed she had suffered a breakdown. The media moved on quickly. Another tragic story. Another researcher too deep into ghosts and superstition. But if you walk the halls of Highclere Castle today, especially at night, you might hear faint footsteps where no one stands. Or find that the ballroom is colder than it should be. Or notice that the mirrors don't quite show the present. And in the West Wing, just above the servants' staircase, there's a new portrait. A young woman. Brown hair. Notebook in hand. Eyes that follow you when you walk past. Amelia is still there. Just like Eleanor. Because Highclere Castle never forgets its sacrifices. It simply buries them. 85.